Chapter 4, Police Strategies, Part 1. In the 1970s, we finally began to see more and more police research being done by scholars, by academics, by even the police departments themselves. As we said in an earlier lesson, the federal government provided a bunch of funding for some of these research studies, and then some took off on their own. One of the most famous studies from this early period in the 1970s was the Kansas City Patrol Study. So this chapter is about different strategies that police employ, and one of the key features of any police department is their patrol division. It's often called the backbone of policing because patrol is the unit in a police department that has the most number of officers. It probably comprises by far the most amount of resources and the most amount of time that's spent by police departments doing any type of policing. And so the question was, we do so much patrol, it's been with policing ever since the beginning, but does it actually work? And so in Kansas City, what the study did was they divided Kansas City into 3 different roughly equal zones. So they tried to keep them the same in terms of demography, in terms of characteristics, whether they were business, residential, industrial. They tried to keep the mix pretty much the same. And what they did was, in one zone, they kept the patrol level at the same level it had always been. The same number of patrol officers, the same number of patrol cars, etc., etc. And then in the 2 other zones, in one of the zones, they saturated the area with patrol officers. So they put twice the number of patrol officers in that area. So they really increased the amount of patrol cars, the amount of officers. And where did they get those officers from? Well, that was the 3rd zone, the other zone that was still available. In that zone, there was no patrol that was being done. The only time police officers were supposed to come into that area was when they were called. So otherwise, they were supposed to stay completely away from it. And so the question was, would there be any kind of major differences between the different zones in terms of crime, in terms of any other social problems? Now, there were some flaws with the study because, as it turns out, many of the police officers ignored the rules, and instead of staying out of the zone where there wasn't supposed to be any patrol, when they wanted to get from one side of the city to the other, sometimes they cut across that zone. Sometimes they entered it when they weren't supposed to. So there were some problems, but overall, the study was pretty good. And what the study found was, at least in the short term, the amount of patrol officers in an area doesn't make a difference. And so you can see it have it, as I've written it here, increasing or decreasing the number of general, and we're talking about general patrol. So officers who are out there just patrolling the community, they're not looking for a specific kind of criminal, specific kind of crime, they're just in general patrol. That increasing or decreasing the number of patrol officers doesn't appear to affect crime, at least immediately. And if you think about it, it's probably has a good deal of common sense involved in that conclusion, in that there's a good bit of common sense involved in it, in that it's not like we're sitting in our homes looking out the windows trying to count how many patrol cars go by at any given time. We pretty much just assume somewhere out there's a patrol car. It's especially if you're living in a city. Now, if you're living in a rural area, you probably assume aren't any patrol cars patrolling around. There's a state police officer maybe somewhere in the area who could be called. But in a city, people aren't constantly watching and counting how many patrol cars. They just assume somewhere out there's probably a patrol car. Now, if we had taken the Kansas City Patrol Study and really publicized the fact that one area wasn't being patrolled and one area was being over-patrolled, maybe in the course of a couple years, or maybe even just a few months, there might be a difference. Maybe people would realize, hey, they're really serious. There are no patrol cars in here. And so I'm going to be able to, break the law. Maybe it's breaking traffic laws, or maybe it's breaking more serious laws. I'm going to be able to, I have a better chance of getting away with it. So that was one of the downsides of the Kansas City study. But at least initially it seemed to show that the idea of throwing more officers out there on the street doesn't necessarily solve a problem. The public doesn't really notice a lot of times how many officers are out there. What they're more concerned about is when we call an officer, does the officer show up? So the Kansas City Patrol study was important for really beginning to make us question the value of patrol. Now, we still haven't really changed patrol that much today, but nonetheless, it did call into question the value of patrol. Subsequent studies have been done, and they've shown similar kinds of things. They've shown that general patrol just isn't a major deterrent to especially serious crime. That the ordinary criminal isn't worried that a patrol car is going to go passing by just as they commit a crime, because they're probably committing it inside. Even if they're committing it outside in the streets, maybe they'll take a quick glance and see no patrol car. So saturating an area with patrol and on general patrol, not specific patrol or directed patrol like we're going to talk about a little bit later, probably doesn't do a whole lot. Response time studies. One of the key features of the professional era of policing that we studied all the way back in Chapter 2 was that we should equip the police so they can respond as quickly as possible to a citizen's call for assistance. And so in the 1970s, there were questions about, well, is that really effective? Does response time really matter? And instead, what the studies found was that response time, in terms of how long does it take the police to get to the scene after they've been called, isn't very important. What's more important, or at least in most cases not important, what's more important than response time is how quickly does it take, how much time does it take the citizen, to the victim or the witness, to call the police after the crime has occurred. So that's more important than how quickly the police respond to the scene. Response time is only important, police response time is only really important when the citizen, the victim, the witness has called the police while the crime is occurring or while the criminal is still in the area. Then it's important for the police to respond as quickly as possible. But if you go home for the weekend and you come back and you find that someone broke into your apartment and you don't know when they broke in, it could have been on Friday, could have been on Saturday, could have been on Sunday when you returned, but you're not sure. If you call the police, there's no reason for them to come with lights and sirens, because unless that thief is hiding somewhere in your apartment, they're long gone. So if it happened on Friday and this is now Sunday and you call the police, does it really matter that the police arrive in 30 seconds? No, because the crime occurred on Friday, a couple days before. So how much time elapses between the commission of the crime and the report to the police is more important than how long does it take for the police to respond after the crime has been reported to them. What the response time studies taught the police is that their dispatchers should really prioritize calls. Not every call requires prompt response. If it's nothing urgent, then the police can respond when they get to it if there are more important calls in front of them. So, I mean, this makes a whole lot of common sense, but if there's a call of an assault in progress, well then, yes, get the police there as quickly as possible, especially if it's a serious assault. But if it's a call about, a theft that occurred 3 weeks ago, and the owner just wants to report it because the insurance company requires it, well, then the police don't have to get there right away. That can be a low priority call. So these response time studies encourage the police to start prioritizing calls having differential response rates, or differential responses, as it's often called, to respond urgently to urgent calls and more calmly, more slowly if unless they have the time and nothing else is happening. So to take more time when it's a less urgent call. Some of the other landmark studies that are detailed in your book include studies of investigation. Even today, we watch all these movies about and see television shows like CSI, and we think, wow, forensic science can just solve everything. and detectives are all Sherlock Holmeses. And you can probably name at least 10, 15 television shows about a detective who can take one little piece of evidence and solve the crime. Well, that doesn't really happen in real life, at least not often. What the studies found was that only a small number of serious crimes are involved. So when detectives become involved, so this isn't a crime that the police officer, the patrol officer on the street who first responds can solve right away. Some kind of simple crime. There was a bar fight, and they can solve that crime pretty quickly because two people got into a fight. They're maybe still present at the scene, and there isn't a whole lot to investigate. But when there are crimes that are referred to detectives to try to investigate and solve, only about 20% of those are ever solved. When they are solved, what the studies found was it really wasn't because of some kind of ingenious manipulation of evidence by detectives. It was because victims had provided leads and information that gave a pretty good clue about who did the crime, what had happened. So it wasn't, like we see in the television shows, that it's some really smart, ingenious detective who picks up on a little clue and that leads him or her to solve the crime, solve the case. Instead, the conclusion was that most of the serious crimes, when they were solved because a victim or a witness could provide enough information to allow the detectives to solve it. In a great majority of the cases that were solved by detectives, the suspect's identity was either already known or it was pretty easily determined because of the description that witnesses were able to give, or maybe there was a videotape or something else that made it pretty easy to locate the suspect. So, on television shows, we always find out that the suspect had moved across country. There was hardly any evidence. There was one piece of hair that they found, and they were able to trace that to the offender. Well, that doesn't happen so often in real life. What happens instead, if you're going to solve the crime, it's probably because we already knew who did it. And that sounds where we had a pretty good idea who did it. And so that sounds like pretty much a no-nonsense case, but that's what happens most of the time. Detectives are really limited in what they can actually do, unlike how they're portrayed on TV or in the movies. What did detectives do then most of the time? And you can see here that they spent it mostly doing paperwork, reviewing reports, trying to locate witnesses. All of these were low probability actions in terms of solving the crime. Doing these things was probably not that, wasn't going to produce a result, so we have to question whether their time was really well spent. So really, these studies really called into question the abilities of detectives to actually solve crimes when there's very little evidence, when there isn't a clear identification. What they also found was that police collect a whole bunch of evidence, but most of it's never analyzed, never used to solve crimes. So they collected a lot of information, but most of it is not useful for actually solving the crime, or it could be useful, but nobody really takes a close look at it. So we had to question, why are we collecting so much information? I taught terrorism for a few years when I taught at Pitt, and I talked to a bunch of FBI agents and other counterterrorism agents, and they all agreed the problem isn't getting information, getting intelligence, it's being able to analyze it. They are swamped with information. How do you go through it and find what's important and what isn't? And so that's a problem, whether we're talking about detectives and ordinary policing or we're talking about counterterrorism. How do we sift through all the noise to find what's important?